chaos calls, but all you really need is to just breathe. Third cup of Joe just to get me through the day. Wanna make the most of time, but I feel it slip away. I wonder if there's something more to this crazy life. I'm busy, 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 and it's no surprise to see that I only have time for me. There's gotta be something more to this crazy life. I'm hanging on tight to another wild day when it starts to fall apart. In my heart I hear you say, just breathe, just breathe. Come and rest at my feet and be, just be. Chaos calls, but all you really need is to take it in, fill your lungs, the peace of God that overcomes. Just breathe. Let your weary spirit rest. Lay down what's good and find what's best. Just breathe. Just breathe. Just breathe.
Well, good evening, and on behalf of Highland Park United Methodist Church and our senior minister, Paul Rasmussen, and our entire congregation, I welcome you to this space. We are so grateful that you have taken this time, and for many of you, your third night in a row now to be here in this space and to share time with Professor Wright. What a gift it has been. I am honored. I'm Phil Dickey. I'm one of the associate ministers on staff here, and it's just a privilege and an honor to be here to welcome you all and to see so many wonderful faces and people that have been roaming around for the last 3 days. Perkins is way more exciting when there's 1,000 people roaming around for 3 days. So, not that Perkins isn't always exciting. Don't get me wrong. I'm an alumni. I can say that. But we really are grateful, and I would like to just really say a special thank you to Priscilla Pope Levison for really her leadership in making this happen. Yes, let's give her a big round of applause. Because when someone comes to you and says, hey, could you possibly host NT Wright for 2 nights? Yes, we can, and we would love to. So it's a huge gift to us, and so thank you for the partnership. We truly, as a church, are just honored. And so we've been also blessed by all the churches we've had the opportunity to work with in this. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for this opportunity. And with that, I would love to just welcome up Priscilla to come and to introduce Tom. I'm going to remind you one more time that there are still books available up there for sale. So if you haven't gotten one yet, don't leave here without getting some wonderful work. I know you've heard his voice, but take it home so you can read it too. So, my friend Priscilla.
Before I introduce Tom Wright, and I know that many of you have been here another night or two, so you'll have to sit through this again. This would not be possible, especially those of you who are here for no cost to you, except for coming early and trying to find a place to park. We were able to offer that this time around thanks to the generosity of several churches and sponsoring bodies. And again, I want to shout out to Highland Park United Methodist Church, Highland Park Presbyterian Church, Church of the Incarnation, St. Michael and All Angels, the Episcopal Diocese of Dallas, the North Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, and the Office of the University Chaplain and Religious Life, Dr. Steve Rankin of SMU. There are also several individuals, Phil and Teresa Lack and June Dales. So I am so grateful for their sponsorship and delighted that you are here because of them. But we're all here to hear from N.T. Wright one more time, and you can keep listening to N.T. Wright, maybe as you fall asleep at night with that lovely melodious British accent. These lectures have been recorded, and they will be on the Perkins website as soon as we can get them on. But as most of you know, N.T. Wright is Research Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at the University of St. Andrews, where I did my PhD, lovely place. And he served in multiple positions within the Church of England, including Bishop of Durham, Canon of Westminster Cathedral, and Dean of Lichfield Cathedral, as well as holding university posts at Oxford University, McGill University, and Cambridge University. As you know, he teaches and speaks around the globe, from Atlanta to Rome, from Harvard to the London School of Economics. His published books number nearly 80, and I'm sure next year it will probably surpass that if it hasn't already. And they range from biblical commentaries for everyone to academic works, including the multi-volume Christian Origins and the Question of God series. So, please join me in welcoming one last time to Dallas, Texas, well, maybe not the last time, but last time for now, Professor N.T. Wright.
Thank you, Priscilla, and thank you all once more, and thanks again to those who have made this possible, both by their generosity and by their ferocious administration. There's been an amazing amount of work going on behind the scenes and sometimes in front of the scenes, and it's been wonderful to see, and all I've had to do is to sit back and enjoy watching other people scurry around, and then from time to time stand up and say something, which is what I sort of do. It has been a delight to be with you this week, and it was far too long actually since the last time I was here, and I hope it will be not quite so long next time. If it is quite so long next time, I will be nearly 100, so there we are. But thank you for your hospitality and friendship and the warmth of your response, and for the encouragement that that gives to a wandering scholar who spends his life trying to understand the gospel and scripture and puzzle about what they mean today and tomorrow. And it's about tomorrow, the future, that I want to speak this evening as we build on the previous two lectures and talk about Jesus and the future. I'm going to be slightly more formal this evening in one respect only, dividing this lecture into three distinct parts. You'll have noticed that the last two lectures had no formal divisions at all. I just rabbited on for an hour or so, and you kindly stayed with it. This evening I want to talk about the framework of God's future, the failure of our future, and the challenge to be people of God's future in the midst of the failure of other futures. We have been aware these last weeks, months, that we live in troubling and challenging times, and it's vital that thinking Christians figure these things out as best we can and learn the difficult art, and it is difficult, of living and speaking God's future in the present uncertainties. Now, many of you, it turns out, have read my book, Surprised by Hope, which is very gratifying. I get a lot of letters, messages, etc. about that book particularly. I say at the start of one of my other big books recently that I've been kind of writing books the way that somebody might be trying to shoot rabbits in the dark with a shotgun. You know, we know they're out there somewhere, bang, 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 and sooner or later you hit one, and that was Surprised by Hope. And Surprised by Hope lines up the arguments for reconsidering the whole framework of Christian eschatology. And I've argued there, as I've said in the present lectures, that the normal Western assumptions about going to heaven when you die are radically mistaken, and that the framework of thought which that involves, expressed in hymns and liturgies as well as regular teaching, owes far more to Plato and Platonists than to Jesus or Paul or the other early Christians. We have taken for granted a radically dualist worldview in which the present space-time universe is seen as a bad, sad place, in which matter as we know it, stuff, is corrupt and decaying, and we want to leave it behind and go off to a world of pure disembodied souls. Now, within that dualist worldview, many revisionist Christians have felt it necessary to deny the resurrection of Jesus or of ourselves in the future, because it makes no sense. If bodies are bad, why would you want to have one back again? And often the only response of conservative Christians has been simply to assert that even though it makes no sense, God did it to show how powerful he is. And many of our angry, ongoing debates between radical and conservative have been between two kinds of deist, those who think the distant God doesn't intervene in the world and those who think he does, with neither side guessing that perhaps the entire deist model was wrong in the first place. And that ill-considered non-debate nests within your culture wars as left and right play out the values apparently inherent in the 18th century model. As long as we play the game on that playing field, there will be a lot of noise and blood, but no winners. What I've been arguing this week is that in the message of Jesus, we see a radically different playing field, and that having tried to play the game on our own present one and discovering it doesn't work, it might be a good idea to go back to the original one and start again. And for that, we need to begin where the Christian hope really gets going, with Jesus' resurrection. That provides the framework for all consideration of God's future. So, the framework of God's future. Just to be clear, without the resurrection, nobody would have taken seriously Jesus' announcement of the kingdom of God, or the news that this was the time for God to become king as he'd always promised. Without the resurrection, no one would have thought for a moment that in and through Jesus, Israel's God really had returned in power and glory. Without the resurrection in particular, nobody would have thought that Jesus' death was anything other than another horrible failure, another young man with big ideas who found out too late that he was wrong. We know of at least a dozen other messianic or similar movements within a century either side of Jesus. They routinely ended with the violent death of the founder, whereupon the others in the movement, always supposing they lived to tell the tale, were faced with a choice: either give up the movement and go and hide somewhere, or get yourself another Messiah, perhaps from the same family. We have evidence of both those things happening in that period. And here's the thing: James, the brother of Jesus, was the great leader of first century Jerusalem Christianity until he was killed by zealous nationalists in the run-up to the war in the 60s. But nobody ever suggested that James was the real Messiah, despite his being a greatly respected leader, a man of prayer and wisdom. They knew him as the Messiah's brother. Jesus, and only Jesus, was the Messiah, because God had raised him from the dead. You can't explain the rise of early Christianity unless you root it in that early belief. And as I've argued elsewhere, we can't explain that early belief either as a hallucination or as a fantasy. They knew about hallucinations and fantasies just as much as we do in the ancient world. They knew the difference between dream and reality and so on. They knew perfectly well that people, the early Christians knew perfectly well that some people might think their belief in Jesus' resurrection was that kind of thing. And they insist, no, it wasn't. They went on insisting that the tomb was indeed empty. People could, after all, go and check. And that Jesus' body had been transformed from the battered and bleeding wreck of Good Friday into a new kind of physicality. This is the hard bit. A non-corruptible body. Still indeed, a body which could be touched, which could breathe and break bread and cook breakfast, but which had other properties that nobody had imagined. A body that seemed to be equally at home in what they called earth, our space, and in what they called heaven, God's space. Indeed, a body, a living person, who seemed to redefine and clarify what heaven and earth really meant, who held those abstractions together within his own new, glad reality, and compelled his followers to see in him the fulfillment of the ancient hope of Israel and the transformed reality of the ancient symbol of the temple. I have spoken about the story and the symbol this week. They've been one of the leitmotifs of what I've been doing. And it's important in thinking about Jesus in the future that we see how Israel's story and central symbol came to full flower in his resurrection. The story always was about creation and new creation, about God dealing with the corruption that followed from human idolatry and relaunching his project of creation. Now, it had happened. New creation had arrived, close up and personal. The symbol, the temple, likewise, had always been seen as the small working model of the entire cosmos, built by the true king and administered and operated by the true priest. Now, Jesus drew onto himself the reality of king and priest and temple alike. He was the microcosmos in person, the place where and the means by which the new creation had been launched. And all this makes it more important than ever that we grasp the reality of bodily resurrection. The word resurrection was never in the first century a generalized word for life after death. That is to say, the word resurrection presupposes a two-stage post-mortem reality, and the word resurrection refers to the second stage in that sequence. God the Creator will make new heavens and new earth, a new world which will be more physical, more full of pulsating life than the present one. God loves bodies. God loves stuff. He loves the creation. He made this world full of life and power and beauty. And if we look at the world with the jaundiced eyes of a world-weary Platonist and think that it's all rotten, full of change and decay and must be done away with, we're missing the point. The Jewish hope of resurrection was always for renewed creation, not the abolition of creation and the establishment of a different sort of thing, as though the Creator decided that the first creation was actually a failed experiment and he'd better do a non-physical one next time round. And actually, the early Christians, just like the Jewish rabbis on for centuries afterwards, saw the resurrection as the place where two vital doctrines met: the doctrine of the goodness of creation and the doctrine of, in the positive sense, judgment. God made the world, he's going to put the world right. That means resurrection. Get rid of one or the other of those and you don't need resurrection. If you've got them both, you do, and they did. So when we're talking about the resurrection, we're talking about bodies, about new creation, about a world, and about human beings being more alive than at present. We need to work on our imagination, as I've said before. It bears repetition, a line I've used many times. Do you know how when you meet somebody you know who's been very sick, and you see them for the first time after they've been sick, you say, poor old so-and-so, he's just a shadow of his former self. Well, if you are part of Jesus' family, in the Messiah, as Paul puts it, if you are indwelt by the Spirit, you are just a shadow of your future self. There is a real you which God has got planned and ready, and when you are given your new body, you will say in surprise and delight that this at last is the person you were meant to be. And that, by the way, is why ancient and modern Gnosticism denies the resurrection. Not simply because Gnosticism devalues the physical world, but because Gnosticism thinks it already knows what its true self is, a little bit of hidden elite reality inside somewhere, not as a fresh gift from the Creator. So the framework of God's future is set by the bodily resurrection of Jesus and by the promise that the life-giving Spirit will do for all God's people at the end what he did for Jesus on Easter morning. But this only makes sense within the larger promise, as in Romans 8, that the creation itself will be rescued from its present state of corruption and decay. If you're going to have a new body, you're going to have a new creation to live in. Creation was itself anyway made to work properly under the wise rule of obedient humanity. And since there is at last an obedient human at the helm of the universe, and since when we are raised, there will be a whole family of obedient, renewed humans sharing in the glorious rule of Jesus. That's how it's going to work. Romans 8, 1 Corinthians 15, Revelation 21 and 22, it's all there. And it's there too in the way the gospel writers tell the story of the first Easter day and the 40 days that followed it. So the framework of God's future is thus established. We live between the launch of new creation and the completion of new creation. And by the Spirit, we are to be people of new creation. New creations in ourselves and also the agents of new creation in the world. My case to you this evening is that many of today's perplexities and puzzles spring from a failure of the church to think like this at all, and from the secular parodies of Christian hope which have sprung up as a result, to which the church has often had no real answer. Because you see, the resurrection of Jesus as the main marker for the framework of God's future is seen in the New Testament not primarily as a strange, bizarre event within the ongoing present order, but as the paradigm and the launching point of the new world order. Jesus' resurrection makes total sense within the new creation, but both the skeptics who routinely deny it and the anxious apologists who routinely defend it regularly argue as though if it happened, it would be simply a ridiculous or apparently impossible event within the old creation. The resurrection of Jesus is therefore the unveiling of the Creator's plan for the ultimate future, the future in which, as the New Testament insists, heaven and earth will be joined together completely and forever in and through Jesus and the Spirit. And with that, we gain a whole new worldview. New creation has been inaugurated, and we are invited, summoned by the King himself, to share in it. Once we get the framework of God's future firmly fixed in our minds, we discover we don't have to sit around and wait for that future. God's mission has been well and truly begun, and it's going ahead in the power of the Spirit. It's making its way in the world through deep paradox, through the mixture of celebration and suffering, of prayer and lament, of witness and weeping, which is the characteristic life of Jesus' followers in the interim period. And what we now need to do as we hold this framework in our minds is to examine our own backstory and discover how in the Western world our cultural dreams and hopes have failed, because our world has tried to get the results of Christian hope without the humility of faith. And the church has backed off from the true gospel and has offered a Platonic one instead. So as we keep the framework of God's future in mind, come back with me to the 18th century, where so much of today's Western world was shaped. So the second section, the failure of our future. I spoke last night of the way in which the Lisbon earthquake of 1755 was a watershed in 18th century culture. Up till that point, it had been possible for great Christian thinkers to suppose that if you studied the natural world, the starry heaven above, and the moral law within, you could argue your way up to a complete Christian theology. This was a time of optimism at every level. The new world had been discovered. America was referred to from early on in Christian eschatological terms, almost as though this was the new creation. And that remains at the root of some of today's global challenges. The Western world was celebrating new travel, new culture, new countries, new trading opportunities, new missionary challenges. The Puritan hope of the 17th and early 18th century was that through the preaching of the gospel and the work of the kingdom, the world would get better and better. Not only were people being converted, social reforms, early technological and medical innovations were producing better conditions, better possibilities all round. And many preachers and Christian teachers envisaged that the ancient promise of the kingdoms of the world becoming the kingdom of God and the Messiah would be fulfilled in the present age through the work of preaching and applying the gospel, producing a millennium, whether a literal or a metaphorical 1,000 years, before the second coming of Jesus, and with it the new creation and the resurrection of all God's people. You can see this theology writ large in one of the great cultural artifacts of that time, Handel's Messiah. Many of you will have sung in performances of the Messiah, or at least heard it in churches or concert halls. I wonder if you've pondered the way in which the Hallelujah chorus comes not at the end of the whole work, but at the end of the second part of the three-part work. In other words, after the gospel events and the preaching of the gospel in the world, but before the general resurrection and the ultimate future hope. That is how many Christians in Europe and America viewed the future. We are going to do the work of the gospel, and that will bring about the kingdoms of the world becoming the kingdom of our God and of his Christ. That is what inspired a great deal of missionary effort in that period and social reform. What then happened in the second half of the 18th century is a fascinating and disturbing transition. It wasn't just the Lisbon earthquake that made people stop and think again. The philosophies of the Enlightenment, whether Voltaire in France, Jefferson in America, Hume in Scotland, or whoever, produced a secular parody of Christian eschatology, an attempt to get the result of the biblical framework, a future of peace and justice and social improvement, without paying the price of Christian faith. And whether that new secular dream was etched into actual constitutions, as in your country, or merely created a new world of thought, as in many European countries, including my own, this is how what Charles Taylor calls a secular age was born. A world in which, for the first time in history, it was not only possible, but appeared almost mandatory to live as though there were no God. The Enlightenment drew, as I've said, on the ancient philosophy of Epicureanism to envisage a world in which God was banished far away upstairs, like an elderly and embarrassing relative whom one might go and visit on occasional Sundays, but who now had nothing to do with running the real world downstairs. And within this philosophy, Christianity became one among many things called religions. A new meaning of that word, as I've said. All of these religions might, it was thought, have some validity as personal spiritualities, as signposts to some distant and unknowable upstairs truth, but none of which possessed absolute truth. This, of course, was a shameless con trick. The argument depends on the secular philosopher possessing absolute truth, demanding epistemological humility from everybody else, especially Christians as the still dominant Western faith, while exercising a sovereign arrogance on their own part. Religions, including Christianity in its different forms, were told that they had no place in public life because they would be divisive, and so they had to learn tolerance. And the Enlightenment philosophers practiced no such tolerance, but simply, as in the French Revolution, killed off anyone who presumed to disagree with the new orthodoxy. Plus ça change. The Enlightenment then produced a parody of Christian eschatology. This is still the cultural reality that dominates today's discourse, whether people realize it or not, in fact, particularly when they don't realize it. Instead of the resurrection of Jesus, the climax and fulfillment of history, we have the Enlightenment itself. Humankind come of age, the new world born through science, technology, and political reform. Getting rid of tyrants, George III in America, Louis XVI in France, was a symbol of getting rid of God so that the world could now run itself. Political eschatology went with everything else. But this brave new world, having been launched, had to make its way to an ultimate eschatology in which justice and peace would at last flourish. And so the Enlightenment generated its own parody of postmillennialism, imagining the world getting better and better with technology and democracy until utopia eventually arrived. Hence, the doctrine of progress, which goes with evolutionism. Please note I say evolutionism, not biological evolution itself, and imagines that there is an automatic process in the natural and the political world by which things are improving under their own steam, and all we have to do is get on board. Sometimes, as with Marx, this had a violent twist in it, since for Marx, that automatic historical process would not simply move forward in a smooth line to utopia, but would generate a revolution that would suddenly destroy the old order and replace it with the coming age. You can see how close a parody that is of Jewish and Christian eschatology. All this is simply borrowed from and then a distorted version of the way in which Christian hope works. And for this to be sustained, it was vital, therefore, to mount a relentless attack on Christianity itself. And the Enlightenment imagined that it now had control of medicine, education, social reform, care of the poor. And so it belittled or sneered at what Christians had always been doing, telling the story of Christianity instead as the story of people using the cloak of religion as a means to power. Sadly, there's always been enough half bits of evidence for that lying around for the charge to stick. Hence, Voltaire, écrasez l'enfant, get rid of the infamy, the self-serving lies of the church. Religion belonged with the old world, really. And if it had any place in the new world, it was upstairs, out of sight and mind. And part of the tragedy of the last 2 centuries and more is that Christianity has largely gone along with this cultural revolution. There are, of course, many glorious exceptions, such as those who campaigned to end slavery, and then, in their way, the social gospel movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But for the most part, the churches have stepped back from public life. We've been content to teach people to pray, to speak of a distant home in heaven, rather than to take seriously the Christian prayer that God's kingdom would come on earth as in heaven. I have spoken about this in various places, and sometimes I've had senior scholars and church figures saying, that's very interesting. I suppose that is what that prayer means about God's... Yes, okay, but we've been so conditioned by the implicit narrative that we've never listened to our own special words. And in America itself, we've seen the earlier post-millennialism. The world is going to arrive at the millennium, and then after that, Jesus will come again. We've seen that replaced by a dualistic premillennialism, which says that the world can't get any better and won't get any better, but will instead get steadily worse until Jesus arrives to snatch his people away to be with him in heaven. And that, as you know, has been the default religion of millions of people in your country, not so many people elsewhere, but which has made a virtue out of Christian irresponsibility, believing that we ought not to sully our hands with worldly affairs. The earlier optimism has been handed over to the secularists who still live by it, and a Christian pessimism has resulted in various kinds of withdrawal from social and political involvement, until recently. Come back to that. There have been other variations on the eschatological theme, of course. The Jesuit thinker Pierre Teilhard de Chardin produced a would-be Christian version of evolutionism in which Christ himself is the omega point towards which all things are developing through present suffering. That faces the same problem as Marxism. What does this utopia say about all those who've suffered on the way? That's why the tragic writer Walter Benjamin, an atheist Jew, declared that nothing less than resurrection of the dead would be required, though it's still not clear exactly what he meant by it. That vision of progress which is going through terrible times, and then eventually the last generation get to enjoy the utopia. But underneath, it reminds me, I think I said this in Surprised by Hope, of a famous old Oxford Don from about 150 years ago, who, whenever his desk got too full of letters and unmarked student papers and bills and goodness knows what, he would simply spread out a copy of the London Times over the whole thing and start again. And very tempting, actually, if you're a university administrator. And apparently after his death, they did a sort of archaeological dig through layers, all this strata. All this. That's the problem with that evolutionary optimism. All very well about the end. What about the stuff underneath? Now, this isn't the place, of course, for a full treatment of all these twists and turns of the last 2 centuries. But it's important that we get clear on the overall way in which the modernist dream of progress and enlightenment has stolen Christianity's proper clothes, even though they don't really fit. And to legitimate that theft has scorned the resurrection of Jesus and all that it means. There cannot, after all, be 2 climaxes of history. And if the real climax came with Hume, Jefferson, Kant, and Voltaire, it can't have come in a strange event on the 3rd day after Jesus' crucifixion. And if medicine and education and care of the poor are now up to the state, then it's obvious that the church shouldn't be involved in them, and so on. Now, you might have thought that the First World War would have put paid to that modernist dream of utopia. It certainly made a big dent in it, with Karl Barth's reaction in his Romans commentary as one major moment of protest in favor of something more like traditional Christianity. And ever since the earlier 20th century, the protests against Enlightenment arrogance, modernist arrogance, have been growing, eventually producing postmodernity in which the big stories are shown up as self-serving. Claims to truth are seen as really claims to power, and the idea of the self, the arrogant modernist parody of the Christian vision of human vocation, is deconstructed into a mass of floating signifiers. And all this is simply a very short way of getting to the present moment. We are a confused generation for whom these various bits and pieces of cultural ideologies, memories, narratives, counter-narratives, spiritualities, identities whirl around and crash into one another without really understanding how or why. And this is why people cling on so desperately to this or that political or theological fundamentalism, producing further parodies as the older shrill certainties of different Christian dogmatisms are replaced by the newer shrill certainties of political dogmas and doctrines. The great secular dreams of the future have let us down radically, but as a culture we don't know what to do about it, because we haven't got any other narratives to live by. And the church has by and large failed to articulate the truth of which those modernist dreams were a parody. Your former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, has said many controversial things, I know, but one thing she said on British radio last week resonated with me. She said, today's electorate are thinking in 21st century terms, while the politicians are still thinking in 20th century terms and offering 19th century solutions. Oversimplification, of course, but actually it makes a lot of sense. A postmodern electorate voting in a late modern political class who offer early modern solutions. We have to do better than that. And with the true Christian framework of God's future, we just might. So, the third section on being people of God's future. We only really understand the mission of the church in the light of God's future. If you think the future is about disembodied souls going to heaven, then your mission will consist of trying to rescue some more of them and not worrying much about their bodies, their health, their poverty, or society at large. If, however, you think that God is making the world a better place by social reform alone, then social reform alone is what you want to do. But if you believe in the radical new creation that was launched when Jesus of Nazareth came out of the tomb on Easter morning, and if you believe that one day God will do for the whole creation what he did for Jesus that day, and if you believe that by his Spirit God is enabling people not only to benefit from that, but to contribute to it in the present time, then mission will look quite different. And this will affect everything. I am always wary of those who say they want to take back their identity or their party or their country from forces that have apparently been allowed to take it over. We have that rhetoric in Britain as well. But I do think that we as Christians must take something back. We must recover our nerve, recapture our vision of new creation, and reclaim the nuanced and spirit-led vocation to live as new creation people within a world that has tried to do its own version of new creation and has failed dismally. And this is where my 3 lectures to you join up. Because as we go about this task, it's vital that we realize the way in which the victory of the cross over the powers of evil is to be implemented by the same means. We who know that the power of self-giving love has overcome the powers of evil must be vigilant, lest we suppose that we can now replace the power of love with the love of power. And this lecture is, after all, about Jesus and the future. If we are to be people of God's future, that can and must only be through the message and the methods of Jesus himself. So let's do what we always should and begin at the end with the ultimate future itself. In New Testament terms, it's always paradoxical to talk about the ultimate future, because the whole point of Jesus and the kingdom is that in Jesus, the ultimate future has come bursting into the present, like an unexpected guest suddenly arriving at the front door when the family is still sleeping in their pajamas. You know, we weren't expecting this. The future has already arrived. We know the name of the coming king, and we already know the means by which his kingdom has come and will come on earth as in heaven. As believers in Jesus and the resurrection, we believe in the ultimate future in which heaven and earth will be one, and we celebrate the fact that this is already true in his resurrection and ascension, and that the truth of it is given to us in the presence and power of the Holy Spirit. So when we look ahead to the ultimate future and think of the second coming, we should resist the cultural pressure and the strident voices that think of this in a dualistic fashion, of Jesus destroying creation and rescuing saved souls. I saw something on the web yesterday which said, I don't know how to spell Armageddon, but it isn't the end of the world. One way of approaching this question is via two passages, Colossians 3 and 1 John 3, which speak of the coming of Jesus, not as an arrival, as though Jesus is a million miles away and has got to make a great long journey, but of Jesus appearing. Heaven and earth, to say it again, are not far apart, as in Epicureanism. They are close, they are intertwined, interlocked. And Jesus is right there, right here, we should say, in the heavenly realm which is all around us. The veil between his world and ours is normally relatively opaque, but there are times and places at which, and there are even people through whom, the veil appears thin, almost transparent. And one day, the veil will be removed. And on that day, according to the Psalms and the prophets, according to Paul in Romans and Corinthians, according to John, according to the end of Revelation, one day, heaven and earth will be transformed so that their oldness, their corruption and decay is done away with. That's what is done away with. Not the earth and not creation itself, but its oldness, its decayingness. And they will be made new as Jesus' body was made new. And on that day, of course, Jesus will be personally present to preside over this new creation as its wise and gentle sovereign. And we, the followers of Jesus, raised to new life, will, we are told again and again in the New Testament. I never heard this when I was growing up. Why did nobody tell me this? We will be given new tasks. We won't just lie around in dreamy state. You know, that old Far Side cartoon of the guy sitting on the clouds saying, gee, I wish I bought a magazine. We will be given new tasks, new royal and priestly tasks, to perform with him and under his instruction. The second coming is vital, but it doesn't look like the rapture which fantasists imagine. So, when we think of Jesus in the future, we are confronted with that framework of the end which has already happened and the end which is still to happen. And we conceive of our whole life, our mission, our call to holiness within that framework. The end has already begun. And by the Spirit, we are called to live in the present time by the standard of the future. And the great biblical image here is that of being morning people while the world is still asleep. We who know about time zones and jet lag can understand this quite easily. When it's 2 in the morning here in Dallas, it's already 8 in the morning in London. And if I was a London businessman visiting Dallas, I would be getting up at 2 a.m. to be in touch with my office at 8 o'clock London time. In the same way, the world as a whole thinks the old creation is still rumbling along and setting the clock. But we who are caught up in the movement of Jesus and the future, of the kingdom and the cross and the resurrection and ascension and spirit, we must be up early while the world around thinks all sensible people should still be asleep. We are Jesus and the future people, even though the world wants to keep Jesus locked up safely in the past or in the safe space of upstairs private spirituality. Can't be done. He is up and about, and we must be too. What might this look like? 4 points, of which the fourth and final one subdivides before my eventual conclusion. Think yourself lucky, you've only got 4 points within 3 points. I did a talk this morning which had, I think, 18 points when I counted them in retrospect. How can we be people who live by the framework of God's future in a world where other future dreams have gone so horribly wrong? The foundational point is that the crucified and risen Jesus is already Lord of the world. Caesar is not Lord. Democracy itself, our modern version of Caesar, is not Lord. Vladimir Putin is not Lord. Nobody elected or unelected is Lord. Jesus is. What does that mean in practice when these people all have tanks and guns and Jesus doesn't? It means, of course, as we saw last night, that the New Testament offers a radical redefinition of power, of lordship itself. There is a power let loose in the world, the gospel power. And you may say, it's not very effective. Think again. It has transformed world culture, and it continues to do so. I recommended to somebody else earlier today John Ortberg's book, Who is This Man? If you don't know that book, please read it. It makes this point at much more length than I can here. But for instance, most nations now assume some version of human rights, however much we argue about it, however badly we implement it, we sort of assume it. Nobody, apart from the early Christians, dreamed of such a thing in the ancient world. Most people now see poverty and disease as a problem to be addressed. In the ancient world, they just shrugged their shoulders. That's how things were. The world is gradually recognizing, as Jesus obviously did, though sadly the church often didn't, that women are fully human. Much of the world knows in its bones, even though it's hard to live up to it, that patience and humility and forgiveness are good things. In the first century, nobody apart from a few Jews and those crazy Christians thought that way at all. We should not downplay or ignore those. Those are major cultural shifts. Nor should we let the Enlightenment try to claim them as its own and then distort them as it always does. As the former Pope said to the United Nations in April 2008, if you cut off the Christian roots of human rights, you can whistle for the fruit. You will be left with a bunch of single-issue fanatics using the language of rights but ignoring their basis. And this is, of course, precisely what's happened. Tragically, many Christians have played the same game. I was in New York when the Pope made that speech at the UN. It was a splendid speech about the real cultural, philosophical roots and nature of human rights and how they can be distorted. A very subtle piece. The next day, the New York Times had a headline, Pope supports human rights. Oh, just missed the point. But all this indicates that the Sermon on the Mount has been working, that the lordship of Jesus is a reality. We should lift up our heads and take courage. Someone asked once the late, great Bishop Leslie Newbegin whether he was optimistic or pessimistic as he looked out at the world. His reply was wonderful and characteristic of the man. He said, I am neither an optimist nor a pessimist. Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. It's a great line. There is a new Lord in charge of the world, and he is establishing his rule in the same way that he won the initial victory, through the power of self-giving love, often working under the radar. And again, those who work like that rely on the fact which they invoke in prayer and celebrate in sacrament, that the powers that enslaved the world have been defeated on the cross. And then such people are implementing Jesus' victory, and they do so by the same means. And this brings into play that wonderful verse at the end of 1 Corinthians 15. What you do in the Lord is not in vain. It may look small, it may look transient, it may look insignificant, but part of the point of the promise of resurrection and Jesus reappearing is that all that is done in his name and in the power of the Spirit in the present time will in fact be part of God's future world when it appears. I have used various illustrations for that in the past, but I hope you get the point. Now, you could read this as good news for private pietists who don't want to get messy with practical life and just want to exercise gentle, quiet influence on society and not do anything too dangerous. But wait, there is more. But before we get to that more, which will be my fourth and last point, let's do point 2 and point 3. Point 2. That all our life in the present is to be lived in the light of the coming resurrection. This is back to the business of getting up early in the morning while the rest of the world thinks it's still dark. 1 Corinthians is the key text here. In one passage after another, Paul is not just offering ethical instructions to deal with this problem or that crisis. He is teaching them to think as Jesus in the future people. What he says about having lawsuits with other Christians in chapter 6 depends on his vision of the future. This is how it's going to be in the future, so why are you behaving like that in the present? Live now in the light of then. What he says about sexual morality and immorality in chapters 5 and 6 depends on his point that what you do with your body matters because God has redeemed it and will raise it at the last. What he says about marriage and singleness in chapter 7 depends on his eschatological vision. We should note particularly that he envisages singleness as a true and eschatologically oriented option in a world where divorced or widowed women were normally required to marry again as soon as they could. His challenge to the church on sacramental and ecclesial life in chapters 11 and 12 have to do with living between the original victory and the final one. He says, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you announce, you proclaim, katangelo is the Greek, you announce the death of the Lord until he comes. In other words, this isn't just, it's an excuse for a sermon about Jesus' death. It may be that, but that's not the point. Sacramental worship is a sign to the world and its defeated powers that Jesus is Lord and that one day his lordship will be fully instantiated. And the wonderful short poem about love in 1 Corinthians 13 makes exactly the same point. Now I see through a glass darkly, then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know as I am known. Now 3 things last: faith, hope, love, but the greatest of these is love. 3 things last. These are things we learn in the present which will last into God's future. Love is the language they speak in God's new creation, and Jesus' people get to learn and practice and speak that language in advance. It's an eschatological ethic. We already belong to Jesus and his ultimate future. So the sooner we get on with learning to live in that ultimate future way, the better. My third point is highlighted particularly in Romans 8, where Paul declares that we are already fellow heirs with the Messiah, provided that we suffer with him in order to be glorified with him. We have normally thought of glorification as meaning either going to heaven or shining like an electric light bulb, or possibly both. That's not what Paul is talking about here. He is working with the Psalms, as he often does, especially here Psalm 2, the messianic enthronement and rule over the nations, and Psalm 8, the Son of Man being crowned with glory, with all things in subjection under his feet. Glory here means rule. What does it mean that Jesus' people share already in his present and coming rule over the world? At this point, some Christians have imagined that this rule over the world consists in themselves seizing worldly power and compelling society to act the way they want. This is a complex issue. I'll come back to it in a minute. But in Romans 8, that's precisely not what Paul has in mind. He is here on the same page as Jesus in Mark 10, explaining to James and John that true power is modeled on the Son of Man giving his life as a ransom for many. What does present glorification look like for Jesus' followers in Romans 8? 2 things: suffering and prayer. The prayer being the groan of inarticulate anguish from the heart of the pain of the world. Creation, Paul says, is groaning in travail. The church is also groaning as we await our resurrection bodies. And then, says Paul, the Spirit is groaning at the heart of the pain of the church, at the heart of the pain of the world. It's an amazing passage. God, the heart searcher, knows the mind of the Spirit. And this, Paul says, is how we are conformed to the image of the Son, that he might be the firstborn in a large family. Extraordinary passage. What does it mean? It means that again and again, the church is called to exercise its messianic rule in the world by standing in prayer at the place where the world is in pain, in order that God the Spirit may be crying to the Father from that point. Many of you are doing that right now, as your churches are resonating with the unresolved groanings that come from our society in pain over so many issues, over culture wars, over political fights, over poverty, over sex and gender, over race and refugees, and much, much more. Our calling is not necessarily to offer quick fix solutions. Do it this way, then it'll be all right. No, we are not to send in the social or the political tanks, even if we could. Our first task is to stand like Mary at the foot of the cross, to pray with groans beyond words from our own pain as it echoes the world's pain, and to know that in this way the future transformation of creation is assured. The heart searcher knows the mind of the Spirit. We are conformed to the image of the Son. This is how the world is redeemed. And as you would expect from followers of the Jesus of the Gospels, this is how his victory is to be implemented in the world. But all this brings me to the fourth and final point, which, as I said, then subdivides a little bit further. We need to reconceive a Christian political theology in the light of the future of Jesus. What do I mean by this? We have allowed the Enlightenment's rhetoric to fool us into thinking that there can be no such thing as a Christian political theology. That was another typical takeover bid, and we must resist it. Instead, starting from God's future and working backwards, as Christians should, it might look something like this. To begin with, we know from Colossians that all powers and authorities and dominions and lordships are made in and through and for the Messiah, and that they are redeemed through him. Colossians 1:15 through 20. It's a small poem, but it says all that and more. Those two parts need to be supplemented from Colossians 2, where Paul says that the powers are defeated on the cross. They are made for Christ, they are defeated on the cross, and then they're reconciled. Exactly as in Psalm 2, once they are defeated, they can return to their proper place. We modern political flatlanders don't like the thought of any actual authorities. We're suspicious of that. But if you pretend that God doesn't want his world to be ruled by wise human beings, and that rulers don't really exist or don't matter, you are just inviting a new kind of tyranny, as history shows. The point is that when God made the world, this is who God reveals himself to be in Genesis. He is the God who decides to work through human beings, who makes human beings in his own image so that he can work in his world through them. There's a profoundly Trinitarian point underneath that in Genesis. When God made the world, he made it in such a way as to be appropriately run by human beings. And the eschatological reality of Jesus in the future is that the world will be run, is already being run, by the human being Jesus himself, and by those to whom he delegates authority. This means that our present earthly rulers are not absolute. They are not messiahs, and we shouldn't pretend that they're supposed to be, nor should we necessarily demonize them if they don't sign up to all our agendas. God wants his world to be ordered because otherwise the bullies and the malevolent prey upon the vulnerable. Of course, as with every other God-given vocation, not least, please, the vocations to be presiding in church, there goes an equal and opposite temptation, not least the temptation, as in the Garden of Eden, to snatch at the knowledge of good and evil, to think that we can now make up the rules instead of humbly learning them from God. But the eschatological vision of Jesus in the future means that all present authority is at best penultimate and must be seen as such. And the task of rulers is radically sharpened up when seen in the light of the past victory of Jesus and his future final coming. We now know what real power is like. It is humble service with the needs of the poor and oppressed and vulnerable at the top of the agenda. Thus, instead of starting from scratch and working up to a theory of the state, as the Enlightenment tried to do in one way and Marx in another, a Christian vision of earthly government starts from the final victory of Jesus the Messiah and Lord and works back to see what real power and authority looks like in the present time. So here's the challenge. The way in which earthly rulers are to be held to account, the way in which they are to be reminded of their proper role, is through the Spirit-led witness of the church. I referred last night to John 16, where Jesus declares that the Spirit will come and convict the world of sin and righteousness and judgment. It's a complicated passage, but in the light of John 18 and 19, we can see clearly what it means. Jesus confronts Pilate on precisely these issues. From the beginning, it has been the church's role to speak the truth to power. Indeed, truth itself, as Jesus found in his argument with Pilate, is a contested commodity. What is truth, said Pilate. He was an imperialist. Truth is what we make it, and we do it with violence. Whereas for Jesus, truth is what happens precisely when, by the Spirit, God's people speak words through which new creation can be named into life. Truth, seen in the light of Jesus in the future, is neither a mere correspondence with the way the world presently is, that takes us back to James and John wanting the top jobs, nor is it simply the subjective sense of each individual. It's true for me, true for you, whatever. Truth, in John's gospel particularly, is the reality of God's new world of justice and gentleness and peace. And one of the central ways it happens is through the creative, Spirit-given words of those who already hail Jesus as Lord, who already belong to the new creation, however uncomfortable it is to be in the new creation while living in the middle of the old one still. And that's why in the same passage, Jesus warns of persecution, of the hatred of the world, though he does say, cheer up, I've overcome the world. This is bound to be the case. And by the way, it ill becomes us in comfortable Western democracies to tell churches in other parts of the world, including places where Christianity is illegal and persecuted, how to address their own rulers. But we have no excuse for not grasping this nettle. That's why I don't think it's quite enough